This wasn't supposed to exist 300 feet underwater. 7,500 years ago, a wall of seawater 400 times more powerful than Niagara Falls drowned an entire civilization. The evidence is now undeniable. Was this the flood of legend? September 13th, 2000. The Black Sea, 12 miles off the Turkish coast. Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, is staring at a monitor in disbelief. His remotely operated vehicle, Little Hercules, has just transmitted an image from the seafloor. At exactly 11:52 a.m., the camera reveals something that shouldn't be there. A wooden beam, notched, hewn by human hands, lying 95 meters below the surface in pitch-black water. Frederick Hebert, the expedition's chief archaeologist from the University of Pennsylvania, would later tell reporters his jaw literally dropped, because this wasn't just any piece of wood. This was architecture, structure, evidence of human habitation in a place where no humans should have ever lived. The site, later designated as Site 82, measured roughly 4 meters by 12 meters. The sonar signature didn't match rocks, didn't match trash, didn't match any of the ancient shipwrecks they'd been finding. This was something else entirely. And here's the problem. At 95 meters depth, this location would have been underwater for at least 7,000 years. But Neolithic people, Stone Age farmers, couldn't build underwater. They needed dry land, fresh water, communities. So how did a human settlement end up at the bottom of the Black Sea? Before we solve this mystery, I need to know something. Have you ever heard about the Black Sea flood theory? The idea that a catastrophic deluge might have inspired the story of Noah's Ark? Drop a comment if this sounds familiar, because most people have no idea this theory even exists, and the evidence behind it is absolutely mind-blowing. The discovery Ballard made in 2000 was actually confirming a theory published 3 years earlier by 2 geologists who've been studying something completely different. In 1997, William Ryan and Walter Pitman, both senior scientists at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, published findings that would shake the scientific community. They'd been taking sediment cores from the Black Sea floor, cylindrical samples drilled deep into the seabed, capturing thousands of years of geological history in layers of mud and shells. What they found didn't make sense. At the bottom of every core, dozens of feet below the current seafloor, they discovered layered mud typical of river deltas. The kind of sediment you'd find in the Mississippi Delta today, rich, fertile, perfect for farming. Carbon dating of shells in this mud showed it was deposited between 18,000 and 8,600 years ago. But directly above that mud layer, they found something Walter Pitman called shell hash, an inch-thick layer of broken shells, the remains of freshwater mussels and snails, creatures that lived in a lake, not a sea, and above that, marine sediments, saltwater creatures, the shells of organisms that only survive in ocean conditions. The cores were telling a story. The Black Sea wasn't always a sea. It was once a freshwater lake, and something catastrophic had transformed it. Ryan and Pitman submitted samples from 5 different cores for radiocarbon dating. They focused on the earliest marine shells, the first evidence of saltwater life in the Black Sea. Every single core came back with virtually the same date, 7,150 years before present. Give or take 100 years. And here's what makes this extraordinary. The consistency of the dates across different locations suggested this wasn't a gradual transition. This was sudden, catastrophic, a geological event so dramatic that it left the same signature across the entire Black Sea basin at the same moment in history. But when Ryan and Pitman ran the calculations for what would be required to flood the Black Sea that quickly, the numbers were staggering. They estimated that 10 cubic miles of water poured through the Bosphorus Strait every single day. That's 200 times the flow of Niagara Falls. Imagine standing on the shore and hearing that sound. A continuous roar of water loud enough to be heard 100 miles away. The water would have raised the Black Sea surface by 6 inches per day, 15 centimeters every 24 hours. Which means, if you went to sleep on the shore one night, the water would be 45 feet closer by the end of the month. And this didn't last for days. According to their calculations, the deluge continued for at least 300 days. Nearly a full year of water cascading through a breach in the Bosphorus bedrock, transforming a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. Let me paint you a picture of what the Black Sea looked like before this happened. After the last ice age ended around 12,500 BC, meltwater from retreating glaciers flowed south into the Black Sea basin, creating a massive freshwater lake. This lake was completely isolated from the world's oceans, separated by the land barrier of the Bosphorus. For thousands of years, rivers fed this lake. The area around its northern boundary, near what's now Crimea and the Sea of Azov, was rich farmland. Scientists estimate that an area roughly the size of Florida was dry, fertile, and perfect for the world's earliest farmers. Archaeological evidence suggests that Neolithic communities flourished here. They grew crops. They domesticated animals. They built settlements near the lakeshore where fresh water was abundant. But here's the critical detail. While the Black Sea Lake remained stable, the world's oceans were rising. Glacial melt was pouring into the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Sea levels were climbing hundreds of feet as the planet warmed. Eventually, the Mediterranean Sea began creeping northward toward the Bosphorus. At some point around 5,600 BC, the rising Mediterranean reached a critical threshold. It topped the natural barrier, a sediment dam Walter Pitman describes as about 400 feet high and 2 miles wide. And when that barrier broke, physics took over. That inch-thick layer of broken shells Ryan and Pitman found? That's the smoking gun. Think about what had to happen for that layer to form. Freshwater mussels and snails living on the lake bottom, thriving in their environment. Then suddenly, within days or weeks, salt water comes crashing in. The salinity spikes. The freshwater creatures die en masse. Their shells settle to the bottom in a catastrophic die-off layer. Millions upon millions of shells, broken by the turbulence of incoming water, compress into a thin geological marker that screams something terrible happened here. And it's not just in one location. This shell-hash layer appears across the entire Black Sea basin. Same depth in the cores. Same radiocarbon date. Same abrupt transition from freshwater to marine conditions. The scientific term for what they discovered is a transgression event, when sea level rises rapidly and floods previously exposed land. But calling this a transgression event is like calling a nuclear explosion a chemical reaction. Technically accurate, but it doesn't capture the scale. Because when they mapped out the ancient shoreline using sonar and seismic profiles, they realized something staggering. The flood inundated approximately 60,000 square miles of land. That's larger than the entire state of Georgia. But scientists weren't prepared for what came next, because when they started looking at the geological evidence for how this flood actually happened, they discovered something that changed everything about how we understand catastrophic events in human history. Ryan and Pitman didn't just study sediment cores. They also surveyed the Bosphorus Strait itself, the narrow channel connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean through the Sea of Marmara. What they found was evidence of unimaginable violence. At the bottom of the Bosphorus, beneath all the accumulated sediment, they discovered a gorge carved deep into bedrock. We're talking 80 to 100 meters deep. That's over 300 feet of solid rock that had been excavated by flowing water. Walter Pitman described the rock in that area as trashy. Geologists speak for fractured and unstable. Even today, rock slides are a constant engineering problem for roads cut into the cliffs alongside the Bosphorus. The bedrock is naturally weak, prone to breaking apart. But here's what's extraordinary. At the bottom of that gorge, they found coarse sediments arranged in dune shapes, all tilted northward, toward the Black Sea. That's the signature of fast-moving water. Water flowing at speeds estimated at 100 kilometers per hour. That's 62 miles per hour. A river moving at highway speeds, carving through rock. And here's the truly unsettling part. When the Mediterranean first breached the barrier, it would have started as a trickle, but water cuts through sediment. As the flow increased, it began eroding the channel wider and deeper. The more water that flowed, the bigger the channel became. The bigger the channel, the more water could flow through. This is what engineers call a positive feedback loop. And it's how you get from a crack in a dam to a catastrophic failure in a matter of hours. Imagine you're a farmer living on the northern shore of this freshwater lake 7,600 years ago. Your family has lived here for generations. You wake up one morning and hear a sound in the distance, a rumble you've never heard before. By the next day, the water is noticeably closer. The day after that, it's reached the edge of your fields. Within a week, your entire village is underwater. Within a month, everything you've ever known has vanished beneath saltwater. Where do you go? How do you explain to your children what's happening? How do you preserve the memory of this event so future generations understand what you survived? Keep that image in your mind, because that human element, that displacement, that trauma, that need to remember is about to become very important. Ryan and Pitman estimated that approximately 70,000 square kilometers of previously inhabited land disappeared beneath the Black Sea. Archaeological surveys of the region show evidence of Neolithic farming communities around the ancient shoreline. These weren't nomadic hunter-gatherers. These were settled peoples with homes, livestock, crops, and trade networks. And in a matter of months, their entire world was erased. If the flood happened as Ryan and Pitman described, it would have been one of the most dramatic catastrophes in human history. The question wasn't whether people survived. Clearly they did. The question was, where did they go, and did they carry the story with them? Because if tens of thousands of people were suddenly displaced on the Black Sea coast, fleeing inland to escape rising waters, they would have brought something with them besides their belongings. They would have brought a story, a traumatic cultural memory of the world drowning, a story about how water came from nowhere and consumed everything, a story that might sound very familiar. Not everyone believed them. Within months of Ryan and Pitman's publications hitting the scientific journals, a team of researchers from Canada began questioning everything about the Black Sea flood hypothesis. And what they found would ignite one of the most heated scientific controversies of the early 2000s. In 2002, a research team led by Ollie Oxu from Memorial University in Newfoundland, along with Richard Hiscott and Peter Moody, published findings that directly contradicted Ryan and Pitman's catastrophic flood theory. Their paper appeared in GSA Today, the same journal that had given Ryan and Pitman such prominence. The title said it all. Persistent Holocene outflow from the Black Sea to the eastern Mediterranean contradicts Noah's flood hypothesis. Oxu's team had been conducting their own surveys of the Sea of Marmara, the body of water that sits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, connected by the Bosphorus Strait, and what they discovered there told a completely different story. Using high-resolution seismic reflection profiles and sediment cores, they identified something Ryan and Pitman had missed, a climbing delta formation at the southern exit of the Bosphorus Strait. This delta, layers of sediment that had accumulated over time, showed clear evidence of water flowing southward, from the Black Sea into the Marmara Sea, not the other way around. The team documented that this outflow had been persistent throughout the Holocene period. They found two distinct delta formations. The older one, which they labeled D2, dated to between 16,000 and 14,700 years ago. The younger one, D1, formed between 10,500 and 9,000 years ago. If water had been continuously flowing out of the Black Sea during this entire period, how could the Mediterranean have catastrophically flooded in? The controversy came down to sediment analysis. Specifically, the direction sediments were deposited. When Oxu and Hiscott examined the bed forms, the patterns in sediment layers, they found asymmetry that indicated southward flow. Imagine sand dunes in a desert. The steep face of the dune tells you which direction the wind was blowing. Underwater sediment works the same way. The Canadian team argued that the bed forms near the Bosphorus exit showed water consistently flowing from north to south, Black Sea to Mediterranean. Fresh water flowing out, driven by riverine input from major waterways like the Danube, Dniester, and Dnieper rivers. And there was another piece of evidence that troubled them. In the Sea of Marmara, they found a layer of organic-rich sediment called sapropel, specifically the M1 sapropel layer. This type of sediment only forms in oxygen-depleted conditions, typically when fresh water sits on top of salt water, creating stratification that prevents mixing. The M1 sapropel dated to the same period Ryan and Pitman claimed the catastrophic flood occurred. But Oxu's team argued the sapropel proved the opposite. It showed that fresh water from the Black Sea was pouring into the Marmara Sea, creating the stratified conditions necessary for sapropel formation. In their view, the Black Sea wasn't being flooded. It was doing the flooding. But here's where things get even more complicated. Because while the Canadian team was challenging the catastrophic flood theory, other researchers were questioning the scale Ryan and Pitman had proposed. In 2009, Liviu Giason from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution published research that suggested something in between. Yes, there was a reconnection event. Yes, Mediterranean water eventually entered the Black Sea, but the flood might have been much smaller than Ryan and Pitman claimed. Giason's team estimated that the initial flooding might have covered an area smaller than Rhode Island, not the 60,000 square kilometers Ryan and Pitman had proposed, not the massive displacement of populations, just a relatively modest rise in water level affecting a limited area. So who's right? Was there a catastrophic deluge that displaced tens of thousands of people? Was there continuous outflow that prevented any flood at all? Or was there something in between, a reconnection event that was neither catastrophic nor gradual, but somewhere in the middle? Drop your theory in the comments. Because here's the thing. Even today, nearly 30 years after Ryan and Pitman's original publication, scientists still don't fully agree. And the reason why comes down to what Robert Ballard found, or more accurately, what he thought he found, at the bottom of the Black Sea. Remember that wooden beam Ballard discovered at Site 82 in September 2000? The one that seemed to prove human habitation at 95 meters depth? Ballard's team returned to that site multiple times. They deployed remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras and sampling equipment. What they documented was intriguing. Not just one beam, but what appeared to be the remains of a rectangular structure. The wood showed tool marks, evidence of having been shaped by human hands. Frederick Hebert, the expedition's archaeologist, was initially thrilled. In interviews, he described the discovery as potentially one of the most significant underwater archaeological finds of the decade. The structure appeared to be oriented with purpose. The beams were arranged in a pattern that suggested intentional construction. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. When they sent samples of the wood for radiocarbon dating, the results didn't match the timeline Ryan and Pitman had proposed. The wood wasn't 7,600 years old, dating to the time of the supposed catastrophic flood. It was much, much younger. The radiocarbon analysis came back with dates ranging from 200 to 1,500 years old. That's not Neolithic. That's not even ancient by archaeological standards. That's essentially medieval to modern. So what's going on? One theory Ballard proposed was that the wood might have been preserved from an older structure, but contaminated by more recent material. Wood at the seafloor can absorb organic matter from its surroundings, potentially skewing radiocarbon dates toward more recent times. But other archaeologists weren't buying it. Because here's the thing about radiocarbon dating. While it can be thrown off by contamination, getting dates that are thousands of years too young requires massive contamination. And there was no evidence of that level of organic material influx at Site 82. The more likely explanation, according to critics, was that Ballard found the remains of a relatively recent shipwreck or coastal structure that had been submerged during one of the many known fluctuations in Black Sea water levels over the past 2,000 years. Hebert himself eventually backed away from the most sensational claims. In later publications, he acknowledged that the dating was problematic and that the structures might not be as ancient as initially hoped. But the problems with the Black Sea flood hypothesis went beyond Ballard's controversial wooden beams. There was a much larger issue that archaeologists had been pointing out from the beginning. Where were the villages? If tens of thousands of people had been living around the Black Sea shores before 5,600 BC, and if they had been displaced by a catastrophic flood, there should be archaeological evidence, not just of submerged settlements, but of where those people went. Rose, an archaeologist who published one of the early critiques in 1999, pointed out that the archaeological record of the region simply doesn't support a massive population displacement around 5,600 BC. There's no sudden appearance of refugee populations in Anatolia or the Balkans. No evidence of new settlements being established by fleeing farmers. No cultural disruption markers that you'd expect from such a traumatic event. In fact, Surveys of northern Black Sea coast, the area that would have been most affected by rising water levels, showed continuous settlement patterns. Communities didn't disappear. They didn't suddenly migrate en masse. They just continued living there, adapting to gradual changes in coastline like coastal peoples have done throughout human history. And then there's the Varna civilization to consider. In what is now Bulgaria, archaeologists have documented a sophisticated Neolithic culture that flourished between 4,600 and 4,200 BC. The Varna culture is famous for producing some of the world's earliest worked gold artifacts, stunning jewelry and ornaments that demonstrate remarkable metallurgical sophistication. These people lived along the western Black Sea coast. They were maritime traders, fishermen, and farmers. Their settlements show continuity and development over centuries. There's no evidence of catastrophic disruption around 5,600 BC. No mass abandonment. No sudden cultural changes that would indicate they'd witnessed or survived a traumatic flood event. If the catastrophic flood hypothesis were correct, the Varna culture should show some evidence of it, either displacement or flooding of earlier settlements, or at the very least, oral traditions preserved in their burial practices or artwork. But there's nothing. The archaeology just doesn't support the story Ryan and Pitman were telling. So if the catastrophic flood didn't happen, or at least didn't happen the way Ryan and Pitman described, why does the hypothesis persist? Why do we still talk about it? Why did it capture imagination so powerfully that it spawned documentaries, books, and endless debates? Because of the connection Ryan and Pitman made, not to science, but to scripture, to myth, to the story of Noah's Ark and the great flood that appears in cultures across the world. And that's where things get really interesting. Because regardless of whether the Black Sea flood happened as described, the hypothesis forced us to confront a fascinating question. Could ancient flood myths be cultural memories of real geological events? But what if the myths are memories? What if every culture that tells a story about a great flood isn't making things up, but preserving something real, something traumatic enough that it survived thousands of years of oral tradition, being passed from grandparent to grandchild, generation after generation, until someone finally wrote it down? Because here's the thing, flood myths aren't rare. They're everywhere. In 1853, an archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was excavating the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital in what is now Iraq. Among the artifacts his team discovered was a series of 12 clay tablets. When scholars finally translated the cuneiform writing, they found something extraordinary, a story about a catastrophic flood. This was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it contains a flood narrative that parallels the biblical story of Noah in remarkable ways. A god warns a righteous man about an impending flood. The man is instructed to build a boat to specific dimensions. He loads it with animals and his family. The flood destroys civilization. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Birds are released to find dry land. The parallels are so striking that when the translation was first published, it caused an uproar in Victorian England. Critics of the Bible claimed this proved the Genesis account was just borrowed mythology. Defenders argued the opposite, that the Gilgamesh story, being polytheistic and embellished with obvious mythological elements, was a corrupted version of a real event preserved more accurately in Hebrew scripture. But here's what both sides agreed on. These stories shared a common origin. Something happened, and cultures across the ancient Near East remembered it. And it's not just the ancient Near East. Flood myths appear in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia or the Hebrews. The Greeks had Deucalion and Pyrrha. The Hindus have Manvantara Sandhya. Native American tribes, the Cheyenne, Blackfeet, and Puebloan peoples, all have flood traditions. Even Australian Aboriginal peoples have legends of massive flood, as do indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest. How many cultures worldwide have flood stories? If you know, drop in the comments, because the answer might surprise you. Researchers have documented flood legends from over 500 different cultures. 500. This is why Ryan and Pitman's Black Sea flood theory captured imaginations so powerfully. In 1998, they published a book titled Noah's Flood, the new scientific discoveries about the event that changed history. The title wasn't subtle. They weren't just proposing a geological event. They were claiming to have found a historical basis for one of humanity's most enduring stories. Their argument went like this. When the Mediterranean breached the Bosphorus around 5,600 BC, tens of thousands of people living around the Black Sea would have been displaced. These weren't primitive nomads. These were Neolithic farming communities with developed cultures, oral traditions, and long memories. As they fled the rising waters, they would have migrated in all directions, north into Ukraine and Russia, west into the Balkans and Europe, south into Anatolia and Mesopotamia, east toward the Caucasus and beyond. And wherever they went, they carried stories with them. Stories about the time the world drowned. Stories about water that came from nowhere and destroyed everything. Ryan and Pitman suggested that this diaspora, this mass migration of refugees, might explain how flood stories became so widespread. The survivors scattered, integrated into new populations, and their descendants preserved the memory of what had happened. But Ryan and Pitman went even further. They proposed something that, if true, would be revolutionary, that the Black Sea flood might explain the spread of Indo-European languages. Indo-European is a language family that includes most European languages, English, Spanish, French, German, Russian, as well as Persian, Hindi, and dozens of others. Linguists have known for over a century that these languages share a common ancestor, called Proto-Indo-European, or PI for short. The question has always been, where did PI originate, and how did it spread so widely? The prevailing theory, called the Kurgan hypothesis, places the Proto-Indo-European homeland in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, around 4,000 to 3,000 BC. According to this theory, the domestication of horses and invention of wheeled vehicles gave these people unprecedented mobility, allowing them to spread their language across enormous distances. Ryan and Pitman suggested an alternative trigger, not horses and wheels, but catastrophe and displacement. If farming communities around the Black Sea were suddenly forced to flee around 5,600 BC, they would have brought their language with them. As these refugees integrated into new regions, their language would have mixed with local dialects, eventually evolving into the diverse Indo-European family we see today. Frederick Hebert, Ballard's chief archaeologist, was intrigued by this possibility. When they found what appeared to be ancient structures at Site 82, he noted that the construction technique, wattle and daub architecture, with branches and sticks embedded in a clay matrix, was exactly the kind built by early Indo-European speaking peoples. Ryan and Pitman even noted something eerie. When you survey ancient settlements in the region around the Black Sea, not one of them is less than 150 feet above modern sea level. It's as if the survivors learned a lesson, as if they collectively decided, never again will we live that close to the water. The most provocative claim in Ryan and Pitman's book was this. They suggested the fertile lands around the pre-flood Black Sea might have been the basis for the biblical Garden of Eden. Think about it, they argued, a place of abundant fresh water, fertile soil, and ideal conditions for the world's earliest farmers. A paradise that was suddenly and catastrophically destroyed, forcing humanity to scatter across the earth. The parallel to Genesis seemed almost too perfect to ignore. Biblical scholars noted that the book of Genesis was written approximately 2,500 to 2,900 years ago, nearly 5 millennia after the Black Sea flood. Could such a traumatic event really be remembered that long through oral tradition alone? Ryan and Pitman believed it could. They argued that the collective trauma was so profound that it became embedded in cultural memory, preserved through countless retellings until it was finally recorded in written form. But there's a major problem with this theory. Actually, there are several major problems. Let's start with the most obvious one. The timeline doesn't match. The biblical flood, as described in Genesis, is traditionally dated to around 2,300 to 2,400 BC if you follow a literal reading of biblical genealogies. The Black Sea flood happened around 5,600 BC. That's a difference of more than 3,000 years. You can't have a historical event inspire a story written about something that supposedly happened 3 millennia later. Second, the scale is completely wrong. The biblical flood is described as global, covering all the mountains, destroying all life except what was on the Arkansas. The Black Sea flood was regional. Significant, yes. Traumatic, absolutely. But it didn't cover the whole earth. It flooded one basin. Third, The archaeological record doesn't show the kind of unified, post-flood restart that Genesis describes. There's no evidence of humanity being reduced to 8 people who then repopulate the entire world. Civilizations elsewhere, in China, Africa, the Americas, continue without interruption around 5,600 BC. And finally, there's a linguistic problem I mentioned earlier. University of Chicago linguist Bill Darden and his colleagues examined when Indo-European languages actually split apart. Their analysis, based on reconstructing ancient vocabulary and comparing it to archaeological artifacts, suggests that Indo-European languages didn't split up before 3,500 BC. That's 2,000 years after the Black Sea flood. So we're left with 2 very different kinds of flood stories. On one hand, you have the biblical account, a global, divine judgment that destroyed all life except what God preserved. It's a theological narrative about sin, redemption, and covenant. Its purpose is spiritual, not historical. On the other hand, you have the Black Sea event, a regional geological catastrophe caused by rising sea levels breaching a natural barrier. It's a scientific hypothesis based on sediment cores, radiocarbon dating, and geophysical evidence. Can both be true? Not as direct equivalents. The events are too different in scale, timing, and nature. But could the Black Sea flood have influenced later flood traditions that eventually contributed to the biblical narrative? That's more plausible. Cultural memories can be long. Stories can merge, evolve, and take on new meanings over millennia. So here's the question I want you to consider. Can a geological event and a theological story both hold truth without being the same thing? Can science and scripture coexist without one negating the other? It's the kind of question that doesn't have an easy answer. And maybe that's okay. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think, because this community has some of the most thoughtful people I've encountered online. So after all the expeditions, all the sediment cores, all the debates, and all the media coverage, what actually happened? Here's what the latest science tells us. And I want to be completely honest with you. The answer is both more complicated and less dramatic than Ryan and Pitman originally proposed. In 2022, researchers published a comprehensive literature review examining all the accumulated evidence about the Black Sea flood hypothesis. Their conclusion was clear. There's insufficient evidence for a catastrophic flood scenario. The authors, including Ali Aksu and Richard Hiscott, the same Canadian researchers who first challenged Ryan and Pitman back in 2002, argue that the waters of the Black Sea most likely gradually outflowed to the Mediterranean. Not inflow, outflow. Fresh water from the Black Sea draining south through the Bosphorus, not Mediterranean saltwater flooding north. And crucially, they noted something that had been bothering archaeologists for years. There was no archaeological evidence of humans evacuating the area during the relevant time period. No mass abandonment, no refugee crisis, no sudden demographic shifts. If the sea level did rise, and most researchers now agree it did, to some extent, the increase was probably around 30 meters, not the 80 to 150 meters Ryan and Pitman initially proposed. That's the difference between flooding a coastal plain and drowning an entire civilization. A 30-meter rise, even if it happened relatively quickly over a few years rather than days, would have been manageable for coastal populations. People could see it coming. They could move inland gradually, relocate settlements, adapt. So what probably happened instead? The current scientific consensus favors what's called the gradual reconnection model. Here's how it works. At the end of the last ice age, both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea were rising due to glacial meltwater, but they were rising at different rates because they had different water sources. The Mediterranean was connected to the world's oceans. The Black Sea was isolated, fed only by rivers. Around 9,000 years ago, not 7,600, the Mediterranean began to push through the Bosphorus. But it didn't burst through dramatically. It trickled. An undercurrent of denser salt water flowed beneath the outgoing freshwater. This created a stratified water column, salt water on the bottom, fresh water on top. Over centuries, this saltwater intrusion gradually increased. The Black Sea salinity changed slowly, allowing marine organisms to colonize the basin. The organisms whose shells Ryan and Pitman found in their cores didn't all arrive in one catastrophic event. They migrated and over time as conditions became suitable. Recent research even suggests that the connection between the Black Sea and Mediterranean may have opened and closed multiple times. Cave records from southwestern Turkey show evidence of at least 12 reconnection events over the past 6,700 years. 12 times a connection opened. 12 times it closed or partially closed. The relationship between these two bodies of water wasn't a single dramatic event. It was an ongoing geological dance. And the archaeology supports this gradualist view. Surveys of settlements along what would have been the ancient Black Sea coast show continuous occupation. The Varna culture we discussed earlier flourished without interruption. Communities adapted to slowly changing shorelines the way coastal peoples have always adapted. There are submerged settlements in the Black Sea. We know this, but they weren't suddenly drowned by a catastrophic flood. They were gradually abandoned as sea levels rose incrementally over generations. People moved their villages inland meter by meter, decade by decade. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. But it's what the evidence shows. So if the catastrophic flood probably didn't happen, why are we still talking about it? Why did Ryan and Pitman's hypothesis capture imaginations so powerfully? Why does it still appear in documentaries and articles nearly 3 decades after it was first proposed? Because it tapped into something deeper than scientific evidence. It offered us a way to reconcile two different kinds of truth. Here's what the Black Sea hypothesis did accomplish. Regardless of whether the flood was catastrophic or gradual, it reminded us that ancient flood myths might preserve real memories of real events, not global deluges that covered every mountain, but regional catastrophes that were global to the people who experienced them. It forced archaeologists and geologists to work together, combining sediment analysis with settlement patterns, radiocarbon dating with linguistic studies. That interdisciplinary approach led to genuine discoveries about how humans adapted to changing coastlines throughout history. It demonstrated that sea level rise, whether rapid or gradual, has profoundly shaped human civilization. The flooding of coastal areas forced migrations, changed trade routes, and reshaped cultures. This wasn't unique to the Black Sea. It happened everywhere that rising oceans met human settlements. And perhaps most importantly, it made us think about how traumatic events are preserved in cultural memory. Because even if the Black Sea flood wasn't catastrophic, floods were river floods, tsunami, storm surges. For agricultural societies dependent on predictable water patterns, flooding was an existential threat. Anthropologists have documented that traumatic events can be preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years. Aboriginal Australians have stories about rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age that match geological records dating back 7,000 to 10,000 years. Pacific Islander navigation myths preserve information about islands that are now submerged. We carry catastrophes with us. We tell stories about them. We use them to explain our world, to warn future generations, to make sense of why we live where we live and fear what we fear. The Black Sea hypothesis gave us permission to take those stories seriously, not as literal historical accounts, but as cultural fossils, preserved memories of real trauma shaped by time and retelling into the myths we recognize today. So was there a Black Sea flood? Yes, probably several over thousands of years, as sea levels rose and fell with changing climate. Was it catastrophic? Not in the way Ryan and Pitman originally proposed. The evidence suggests something slower, more complex, and ultimately more human. People adapting to a changing world, generation after generation, preserving the memory of loss in the stories they told their children. Was it Noah's flood? No. The biblical narrative is something else entirely. A theological story about sin and redemption, not a geological report. But could ancient flood experiences, including events at the Black Sea, have contributed to the tradition of flood stories we find across cultures? Absolutely. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. Someone who doesn't want simple answers to complex questions. Someone who values evidence even when it's messy and inconclusive. Someone who understands that the real mysteries aren't the ones with neat solutions. They're the ones that make us think differently about the world. Hit that subscribe button, because next week, We're investigating something that might actually live up to the hype. An underwater city discovered off the coast of India that challenges everything we know about the Bronze Age. Structures that shouldn't exist. Carbon dates that don't make sense. And archaeological evidence that's been suppressed for decades. The mystery of the Black Sea taught us to question assumptions. Next week's investigation will show you why that skepticism matters more than ever. Until then, keep questioning, keep digging, and never forget, the past is never as simple as we want it to be.